problems appear. They change when the cost of staying the same becomes impossible to ignore. Inside large organizations, stability is always the priority. Systems are built to preserve existing structures, protect leadership, and avoid disruption. Procedures reinforce routine. Incentives reward continuity. Experience teaches leaders that most crises eventually pass, and most of the time, they do. Institutions can survive corruption, inefficiency, financial losses, political scandal, and even years of poor decision-making. These problems rarely force immediate reform because the system still functions well enough to continue operating. This is shadow archives. Real change only begins when the institution loses the ability to maintain the system it already has. When the mechanisms that once protected stability begin to fail. When pressure from outside the institution becomes stronger than the resistance inside it. At that moment, reform stops being a choice. It becomes a requirement for survival. But by the time institutions reach this point, the situation is rarely simple. Years of delayed decisions have already reshaped the system. Internal trust may have weakened. Resources may already be depleted. Leadership may no longer fully understand the forces pushing against the institution. The system is not changing because it wants to. It is changing because it can no longer remain the same. And the forces that create this moment are rarely internal. They come from outside the institution itself. Economic collapse, political upheaval, technological disruption, public backlash strong enough to threaten the legitimacy of the system. These pressures do what internal reform almost never can. They remove the institution's ability to delay. Because when the environment around a system changes faster than the system can adapt, stability stops being possible, and the institution must either transform or begin to disappear. The pressure that forces institutions to change rarely begins inside the institution itself. It begins in the environment surrounding it. Institutions are designed to resist internal reform. Hierarchies protect authority. Procedures slow decision-making. Incentives reward stability over experimentation. Even when leaders recognize problems, the system often lacks the flexibility required to address them quickly. But external pressure operates differently. Markets do not negotiate with institutions. Political movements do not follow internal procedures. Technological change does not wait for committees to approve adaptation. When these forces begin to move, they create stress that the institution cannot easily control. At first, the system tries to absorb the pressure. Financial reserves are used to stabilize losses. Political messaging attempts to reassure the public. Emergency policies are introduced to manage short-term disruption. These responses often work for a time. But if the external pressure continues to grow, the institution eventually reaches a point where its existing tools are no longer sufficient. A financial system may no longer be able to stabilize markets. A government may struggle to enforce policies it once implemented easily. A corporation may discover that the industry it dominated has changed faster than it can adapt. At this stage, the institution begins to recognize a dangerous reality. The environment surrounding the system is changing faster than the system itself can respond. Every delay increases the cost of adaptation. Every attempt to preserve the existing structure consumes resources the institution will need later, and slowly the balance begins to shift. Stability, which once protected the institution, now begins to trap it. The same structures that once created order now prevent the system from adjusting to the new conditions. Leaders may still believe reform can be gradual, but the environment outside the institution has already begun forcing a different timeline, one that the system can no longer control. Once external pressure becomes strong enough, institutions enter one of their most unstable phases. Leadership begins to recognize that the system must change, but recognition does not immediately produce reform, because the institution itself is still structured to resist it. Inside the organization, different groups begin reacting to the crisis in very different ways. Some leaders push for rapid reform. They argue that the institution must adapt quickly in order to survive. They propose restructuring departments, replacing outdated procedures, shifting resources toward new priorities, and abandoning strategies that no longer function in the changing environment. From their perspective, delay is the greatest danger. Every month spent protecting the existing system allows the external pressure to grow stronger. But other leaders see the situation very differently. They argue that the crisis may still be temporary, that the institution has survived similar disruptions before, that aggressive reform could create new problems that are even more difficult to control. To them, stability still appears possible, and preserving stability remains the central goal of the institution. These disagreements are not simply debates about policy. They reveal something deeper about how institutions operate. Large systems are built on networks of relationships, authority, and expectations that develop over many years. Careers are built within those structures. Departments gain influence through the responsibilities they control. Entire professional identities become tied to the system as it currently exists. Reform threatens those arrangements. A policy change may weaken one department while strengthening another. A restructuring effort may shift authority away from leaders who have held power for decades. New strategies may expose mistakes that were made long before the current crisis began. For many people inside the institution, reform does not simply mean adaptation. It means uncertainty. And uncertainty is something institutions are designed to avoid. As a result, the organization begins to split internally. Some groups demand rapid transformation. Others attempt to slow the process down. Committees debate competing proposals. Reports are written analyzing risks that no longer exist while ignoring dangers that are already approaching. Meanwhile, the environment outside the institution continues moving. Markets shift. Public opinion evolves. New competitors emerge. Technologies advance. None of these forces pause while the institution argues with itself. And with every delay, the system loses more of its ability to shape the outcome. Eventually, the institution reaches a moment it tried to avoid. A moment when the pressure from outside the system becomes stronger than the resistance inside it. At that point, reform is no longer something leadership can carefully manage. It becomes something the institution must accept immediately. Eventually, the pressure becomes too strong for the institution to ignore. The arguments inside the system begin to disappear, not because everyone agrees, but because events outside the institution force a decision. Markets collapse faster than committees can respond. Public anger grows stronger than official messaging can contain. Competitors move more quickly than established systems can adapt. At that moment, the institution loses the ability to delay. Reform is no longer a proposal. It becomes the only available option. Policies that once seemed impossible are suddenly implemented within days. Leaders who once resisted change now present transformation as a necessary response to the crisis. Structures that appeared permanent begin to shift with surprising speed. To observers, these changes can look dramatic. Systems that resisted reform for years suddenly begin transforming almost overnight. But the speed of these changes can be misleading, because the forces that created them were building for a long time. Years of ignored warnings, years of delayed decisions, years of pressure accumulating outside the institution while the system focused on preserving stability. By the time reform finally begins, the institution is no longer acting from strength. It is reacting to circumstances that have already reshaped the environment around it. And the reforms that emerge in this moment are rarely perfect. They are rushed. They are incomplete. They often create new problems even as they attempt to solve the old ones. But they happen for a simple reason. The institution no longer has the power to maintain the system it once defended. This is the moment when real change becomes possible, not because leaders suddenly choose reform, but because the institution can no longer survive without it. In the end, institutions do not transform because they want to. They transform because the world around them forces the change. And by the time that pressure becomes strong enough, the future of the system has already begun to shift. This was Shadow Archives.